What are the drivers of human progress, both economic and social? Well, joining me on the podcast to discuss these themes is Douglas Carswell. He is a former member of parliament in the United Kingdom. He's now based in the United States. Douglas Carswell, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
David, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Douglas, could you start off by just giving us a bit of a background, your personal history? I know that you grew up in Uganda and have spent a lot of time in Africa. Mm-hmm. And we obviously a South African organization, and very keen to hear also just a bit about how you became politically active and what motivated you to get involved in politics.
Well, I grew up in Uganda in the 1970s and the 1980s. My parents were doctors working there, and it was a fascinating place to grow up. But it made me think from a very early age, why is it that some countries and some cultures seem to be more successful at producing technological and material wealth? Why is it that some parts of the world seem to thrive and prosper and others don't? And I grew up sort of asking these questions. What is it that drives human progress? What is it that explains why in Western Europe people tended to be very wealthy, whereas in Central Africa and Uganda, they tended not to be? So that from a very early age got me thinking about some of these big questions, which to me, I think are really the essence of politics. We shouldn't think of politics so much as one party against another. I think it's these fundamental questions. What is it that drives human progress? And what can we do to accelerate human progress?
Now, Douglas, a couple of years ago, I read your book, Progress versus Parasites, and you go into these themes in a bit more detail. Mm-hmm. Let's focus on progress first, and then we'll talk about the parasites. But I think some of the themes that emerged there were the importance of specialisation and division of labor, and also free trade. Could you explain why those concepts are so important for human development?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that progress is an aberration. For most of human history, there's been remarkably little progress. Modern humans have lived in Africa for tens of thousands of years. And for most of that period of time, the technology that they used and the standard of living that they had was no different to that of many, many generations before. Why is it that we see this sudden acceleration in human progress? So I think the first thing about progress is to recognize that it's an aberration and that it's relatively recent. And it's only when you recognize that I think you can then begin to explain it. I think the fundamental driver of human progress is the ability of one human or a small group of humans to kind of leverage off the strengths and the abilities of other humans. And this means, in effect, specialization and exchange. We're talking to each other using laptop technology that is so affordable. Many people around the world can now afford it. It might cost you a week's wages, it might cost you a month's wages, it might cost you 6 months' wages, but you can, if you really set your heart to it, afford the kind of technology that we're using now. But you imagine, David, if you or I were to try to build a laptop as an individual from scratch. I mean, there's no one person alive today who could do that. Not even the late, great Steve Jobs could have built a cell phone, a mobile phone from scratch. It's this ability we have to get other people to work for us that makes us so incredibly prosperous. And this network of specialization and exchange has become ever more complex and ever more sophisticated. And it began, I would say, in Northwestern Europe, 350 years ago. And this process of ever growing interdependence has now gone global to the point where we have global markets, and it's elevated the condition of humankind beyond the dreams not only of our great grandparents, but our mums and dads. We now have a living standard that would have seemed unimaginable to people even 100 years ago. And it's this interdependence that I think is the great driver of this great human acceleration. Now, free trade is the way in which you allow specialization and exchange to just kind of happen. You let people in one country buy and sell stuff from people in another country, and you don't interfere. But the great problem in human history has been attempts by what I call the parasites. These are powerful vested interests to basically prevent that spontaneous order. And the parasites have generally prevailed through most of human history. There was no progress because the world was run by the strong, by the warlords, by the dictators, by the Idi Amins of this world. It's our ability to escape from parasitic vested interests that explains human progress. And in countries such as South Africa, where those parasitic vested interests have come back with a vengeance, you see the stalling of human progress. You see a fall in living standards. You see a return and a step back to a less prosperous future. So for me, the real question is, how do we ensure that we don't have parasitic vested interests inhibiting the rest of us from getting richer and more prosperous? And the other great thing I should add is that as well as human progress being measured in economic terms, I think you can measure human progress in moral terms. Undoubtedly, as this process of global interdependence has taken off, humans, I think, have generally become more moral creatures. Human values, I think, have become more tolerant of other people. We've become less defined in terms of clan and ethnic identity. We see this, I think, as a consequence of having to buy and sell and collaborate with people from outside our established family groups. And this great moral achievement, I think, is at risk when parasitic vested interests can stall this great acceleration.
And I think what's amazing about a free exchange of goods and services is that people from different backgrounds who don't know each other at all can basically trust each other and collaborate with one another, even perhaps having never met one another, and still benefit from each other's activities.
Absolutely. That's really the key to it.
And I wanted to try to understand your earlier problem that you framed, which was, why are some countries prosperous and others are poor? And what is the difference? Because it seems that all societies have this tension between this emergent order of progress and collaboration and people working together, but then these parasitic elites that also try to extract patronage or rents from productive people, or to entrench themselves in power. But in the United Kingdom, where you were, spent most of your life, for 800 years since the Magna Carta, there have been checks on the royal power, for example.
Yeah.
But in some societies, there's just elites or parasites run rampant. So why is there this difference in outcomes?
Well, let me answer that question by using a really good African example. And that, I think, is the example of a country I know well, Uganda, a country I once called home. When I was growing up in Uganda, it was dirt poor. The population would grow at maybe 2-3% a year, and the economy would certainly never grow that fast and would quite often actually decline in absolute terms. And so you saw visible poverty with your own eyes. You saw children with no shoes. You saw young babies with evidence of malnutrition, kwashiorkor. Life expectancy was 30-something and falling. It was a country that was returning to a state of absolute poverty. Today, Uganda is prosperous. It has a thriving middle class. Its GDP has been growing at an average of 5 or 6% a year now for nearly 25 years, which is the miracle of compound interest, quite a leap forward. And Uganda, I think, is a real model of how a successful African country can be run. Now, what is the difference? What is the difference between Uganda in the 70s and Uganda today? Trust me, the NGOs and the Western aid agencies would have you believe it's to do with them. It has got absolutely nothing to do with Western aid efforts. The real driver of human progress in Uganda is that there is no longer an attempt, or there's much less of an attempt, I should say, to order Ugandan society by blueprint and design. When the British pulled out of Uganda in the 60s, they did so by putting in place a state architecture that tried to order society by socialist design. So you had a coffee marketing board to control the buying and selling of coffee. You had cooperatives, and you had state regulation of agriculture. You had controls on imports and exports. And then, of course, you had a monopoly currency that the president tended to use as his own personal piggy bank. Creating that administrative state that could try to order Ugandan society by blueprint was a disaster. It created a horrible system of price controls, import and export controls, high tariffs. It was a permission-based economy, and it fell apart. Uganda today is prospering because that simply doesn't happen anymore. You have digital disruption, which means that you, as a Ugandan farmer with access to the internet, you can buy and sell from the cheapest buyer and seller anywhere in the world. You don't have to go through middlemen to get supplies from a producer in China. You've had this great liberalization of the economy. And if you go to Uganda today, everyone everywhere is hustling and running a business of some kind somewhere. You've had this great process of liberalization. Now, of course, you may have some parasitic vested interests in the administrative state there who do the things that corrupt elites have done throughout history, whether it's in Elizabethan England or 21st century Africa. But their ability to actually inhibit economic activity of the rest of their fellow Ugandans is far, far less than it ever was in the 70s. And this explains why a country like Uganda is growing. The reason why Uganda prospers is because the government doesn't attempt to control the economy the way they tried a generation ago. Now, to me, this is the blueprint for not just Africa, but for the whole world. I'm here in Mississippi, where there are some parts of the state where there's been no real increase in living standards in 30 years. Well, if Uganda can have 6% growth a year by liberalizing its economy, surely parts of the world, whether it's other parts of the world in Africa or in Mississippi, could learn from that. Economic liberalization works. Getting government out of the way works. Having a system where you don't need a permit from an official, often asking for a backhander, where you don't need a permit to do something, that is the secret to economic growth and success.
And Douglas, what do you think is the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom? Sometimes people tend to separate these two, particularly when China is being discussed. Yeah. So, well, no, the bureaucrats of the Chinese Communist Party, they are just engineering the economy and are driving towards very high levels of growth, and you don't need political freedom. What would you say to that argument?
Medium term, if you don't have political freedom, you won't have economic freedom. Now, you can find short-term exceptions to that rule, and China today, I would say, is an example of that. There's very little there's very little political freedom. In fact, there's a loss of political freedom, and you still see impressive increases in electricity consumption and energy production and GDP growth. But I think what we're seeing in China is actually a horrible proof of the fact that you cannot have sustained economic growth without political liberty, because I suspect China is actually reverting to its, what you might call its Ming tradition. It is denying people freedom. You now have an increasingly autocratic government in Beijing that is centralizing power. The autonomy that the different provinces enjoyed since the late 1970s is giving way to a much more central system of control. You're starting to see the Chinese political elite clamping down on the prosperous merchant class, what in Elizabethan England or early modern Holland would have been called the merchant class. You start to see people like Jack Ma clearly having to dance to the tune of the Communist Party apparatchiks. And I think this is pretty ominous for the future of China's economic and technological growth. If China continues to undo the liberalizing effects of Deng Xiaoping, if it continues to return to its Ming tradition, it will do what China has done spectacularly over the centuries, which is to not fulfill its huge potential. I think that if you don't have political liberalization in China, you will, I think, end up with a slow-growing, stagnant monolith. People often talk about the inevitability of China's rise. I think actually in 10, 20 years' time, China may look a little bit more Japanese than it does now. Japan was, of course, supposed to be the world's #1 economy by 2020. People talked about Japan overtaking the United States. Japan, having invented the Walkman, then went on a 30 to 40-year holiday from history in economic terms. I suspect China may do something similar if it doesn't liberalize. Centralization, the exercise of political power over the entrepreneurial class, it's all looking pretty ominous for China in terms of sustained economic growth. Innovation fundamentally depends upon chaos. It depends upon innovation. It depends upon people being able to come along and try different things that upset powerful vested interests. I think it's difficult to see how China that returns to its authoritarian Ming tradition will be able to continue to be as innovative as it looked to be for a fleeting moment. The nationalization or the state control of some of the big tech enterprises in China, I think, is a sign of things to come.
Yeah, and that is one of the criticisms of the Chinese model, is that it stifles innovation. I think one of the beauties of market-based economies is that there is a principle of permissionless innovation that occurs.
I mean, never forget that China invented the wheelbarrow, they invented compass, they invented gunpowder, they invented printing, they invented paper money. I mean, there's an incredibly long list of Chinese innovations, but it was Europeans who were able to utilize those inventions. And there's a reason for that. And that is because in China, historically, the people with power have prevented spontaneous order. They prevented people from doing things differently. And I fear we're beginning to see a return to that in China now. I think all this bodes rather well, actually, for the long-term prospects of both India and the United States. Those are two giant economies that don't have this tradition of top-down autocratic regulation. I think if I was a betting man, you never get rich by betting against the United States. And I think India, with its rather more chaotic model, is probably a long-term better bet, precisely because it's a parliamentary democracy, a long-term better bet than China.
So Douglas, a few years ago, I read Why Nations Fail by Acemoglu and Robinson. And their thesis was that institutions play a critical role in determining the prosperity or poverty of a country. And they highlight the Korean Peninsula as a good example, that the South has inclusive institutions, which is based on some semblance of individual rights and free market activity, whereas the North has extractive institutions that stifles productive activity and innovation and essentially just enriches a very small elite. And I know in your book, Progress versus Parasites, you were quite skeptical of this thesis. What do you think of this argument of the role of institutions in economic development?
I think Acemoglu and Robinson's book was a brilliant book because it was a serious attempt to try to explain the relative successes of some cultures versus others. And I have to say, I think we do need to recognize this, that some cultures and some societies are better at producing human progress than others. And why this is, I think, is something that needs to be properly explored, and it hasn't been. But I think the institutional explanation offered by Acemoglu and Robinson will only take you so far. Clearly, if you have certain institutions that limit the power of autocrats and that disperse power, Rome had various institutions, the Senate and under the Republic, various constitutional arrangements that very effectively dispersed power amongst magistrates who competed for public office. Venice, a very successful and prosperous republic in the Middle Ages, similarly had a series of institutions that did much the same job. The Dutch Republic, which was the great, I would say, the home of the Industrial Revolution, I think they beat the English to it by a couple of hundred years. They again had institutions that did the job. The United States of America, which recreated many of those Roman Republican institutions, the Senate and the Capitol, they built them on the banks of the Potomac in America. They too have the institutions that disperse power and prevent power being in the hands of any small factional vested interest. Institutions are really important in explaining, but institutions will only take you so far. What Acemoglu and Robinson don't do is explain why it is that some societies produce inclusive institutions, to use their phrase, and some don't. And they end up sort of talking about it as though it's almost accidental. I don't think it's accidental at all. There are numerous countries in the Americas that achieved independence from European powers. The United States achieved independence from the British. Why is it that the United States created the institutions which explain why in 2021 people are trying to move from Guatemala and Mexico to live in America and not the other way around? I think Acemoglu and Robinson don't really address some of the underlying ideas, which, I think institutions are ultimately shaped by the ideas within a society. And there's an ideological, or rather I would say an intellectual explanation as to why some societies produce institutions that constrain the powerful. Institutions really are the means by which parasitic elites are constrained. I don't think there's sufficient explanation as to why the powerful elites in a society are constrained. Take Africa again as an example. Post-colonial Africa was full of countries with the most wonderful constitutions, with the most wonderful parliaments and supreme courts, who were capable on paper of preventing the rise of autocratic dictatorships and Mugabes and Idi Amin's. But simply having those institutions proved pretty hopeless because there weren't the underlying ideas that are needed to sustain institutions.
Douglas, I'd like to turn the conversation now towards a big part of your political career, which was the Brexit campaign. Mm-hmm. And many people here in South Africa observing from the outside looking in, were somewhat skeptical about this. They saw this as a kind of a nationalist reflex against the kind of cosmopolitan and multicultural project of the EU. I had some of those misgivings as well, but the more I read, your commentary and other analysis, came to kind of understand and sympathize with the Brexit view as essentially being a campaign around sovereignty of nations. What is the genesis of this idea and this political project that you embarked upon?
It's totally understandable, David, that if you only learnt about Brexit through the BBC or CNN or the Western media, you would tend to have a pretty negative view towards it, because you would have been told by the people who produced the BBC that it's essentially a xenophobic, nationalistic, anti-modern reaction against this wonderful, supranational, modern institution called the European Union. Actually, I think that narrative tells you more about the biases and the prejudices and the preconceptions of Western news reporters than it does about actually why Brexit happened. I'll say a little bit about why I supported what became known as Brexit. I became convinced in the early 1990s that the European Union was a catastrophic mistake, not just for Britain, but for the entire European peoples. Why? Well, why is it that Europe has been so phenomenally successful? Why is it that Europe, which after all, let's face it, it's not even a proper continent, for goodness sake, it's just a peninsula off the Eurasian landmass. Why is it that Europe has created the greatest innovations, the greatest advances in medical technology and science? Why is it that the Portuguese ended up sailing around the Horn of Africa and discovering, I should put it in inverted commas, parts of Asia, not the other way around? What is it about this curious part of the planet that isn't particularly rich in natural resources, that produces this great sort of extraordinary series of nation states and cultures? I think it can only really be explained by the fact that Europe was never centrally governed. China was centrally governed famously by emperors. Japan was. India had a series of parasitic emperors. The Ottomans famously had a sultan who presided over tens of millions of subject people. But ever since the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe was a mosaic of competing nation states. And that model of competing entities was the great driver of European progress and European innovation. It explains why what was a relatively backward, technological backwater, Europe, became the seat of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and the great human leap forward. The European Union, I think, is a denial of that European tradition. It's an attempt to create what you might call an imperial architecture over Europe. It's a sort of restoration almost of the Holy Roman Empire, where you have a small elite presiding over Europe and directing it without accountability to its constituent parts. And it's a profoundly bad and disastrous idea. The European Union is making its constituent parts ever weaker. We saw a vivid and terrifying illustration of this, for example, in terms of public policy response to COVID. While non-European parts, non-EU parts of Europe were able to innovate and able to adapt and able to get the vaccine very quickly, those parts of the European continent that are governed by this latter-day Habsburg Empire were slow to create vaccine programs and roll out the vaccine. Now, if they're that inept and bureaucratic and ham-fisted at rolling out a vaccine, imagine what untold damage they're doing in all those less visible areas of public policy. Europe today has regulations on data protection that inhibit the creation of a data-driven economy. They have policies on energy that price European producers out of world markets. They have stringent standards on consumer regulation created in the interest of various vested interests that basically ensure that European consumers don't enjoy the cheap products that people in America and Asia can enjoy. Europe is gradually turning itself into a 21st century museum. It's becoming a continent defined more by its past glories. It will become a wonderful place for Chinese language students to go and study for a couple of years, but it's simply not that hotbed of innovation that Europe has been for the past 300 years. Where are the European versions of Facebook? Where are the European versions of Microsoft? Isn't it telling that, when someone like Elon Musk travels from his native South Africa, he doesn't go to Belgium, he doesn't go to Britain, he doesn't go to Germany, he goes to the United States. Where is Europe's version of Stephen Jobs and Bill Gates? They're probably working in a government bureaucracy rather than doing the things that Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Stephen Jobs did. Europe is essentially pricing itself out of world markets, regulating itself out of the ability to innovate. By leaving the European Union, Britain, I think, allows itself to leave this bureaucratic empire. I hope by its example, it will help to create the centrifugal forces that will peacefully, I hope, tear the EU project apart. I think we're seeing evidence of this. I hope the Scandinavian countries do their equivalent of Brexit. I think Europe will be a happier, more prosperous place if it is governed by its member states, by its individual peoples through democratic self-determination, rather than by this Habsburg elite based in Brussels.
Yeah, and I think one of the most persuasive arguments was this issue of political accountability, that essentially what the EU did was outsourced politics to bureaucrats in Brussels and disconnected individuals in their communities from their political representatives. The European Union subcontracts policy making out to technocrats who aren't accountable to the public. And then they're incredibly bad at what they do. And we see endless evidence of this. We see, for example, a common agricultural policy that uses huge subsidies to produce mountains of food that people aren't willing to buy at a price they're willing to pay. We see a trade policy that inhibits economic growth. I mean,
pretty much everything the European Union has touched has turned into a public policy mess, and yet there's no accountability. If you had a democratic structure in Europe, you could identify the public policy error, and the public could hold those who make public policy accountable, and they would be sacked. But in Europe, that never happens, and this is a corruption of the democratic ideal in Europe. I think it will have profound consequences. Already we see, it's an untold story that people don't like to talk about, but millions of middle-class Europeans are leaving Europe leaving the European Union to go and to London, amongst other places, because they can enjoy a living standard and a prosperity outside the European Union that they simply couldn't enjoy. They're almost refugees of monetary union. They simply couldn't have the kind of lifestyle that they can have in London or the United States or Canada. That they simply couldn't have that kind of lifestyle if they were to remain in Paris or Rome or Milan or elsewhere in Europe. So I mean, I think, you know, these theoretical objections to the European Union are going to become manifest in very obvious and quite horrific ways really quite soon. The failure of the European project to create prosperity and wealth is becoming ever more obvious. Britain's better off out, and I hope other countries will also decide that they've had enough of it.
Yeah, I think it's a fallacy to think that politics is just an exercise in tinkering with policy, and that it's a technically driven project. It's very much the expression of political ideas, and I think that was often what was lost in the debate. So Douglas, could you take us back to the start of the Brexit campaign? Because I mean, you, amongst a handful of others, were early advocates of it. How did you manage to take Brexit from this relatively fringe issue into this huge kind of tidal wave of public opinion that it eventually became?
Well, the first thing is, when we had this idea that, for the reasons we've been discussing, the European Union was a disaster, the first, and it seems obvious now, but the first thing we had to do is to work out what should our objective be. And we toyed with the idea of going for a referendum. And that seems obvious now, but it wasn't obvious at the time. There was some discussion as to whether or not we should try to use the vehicle of a parliamentary majority. But it became obvious that actually the only way that you could overcome the inert establishment in Britain, which was wedded to its lazy idea of EU membership, the only way you could challenge that would be through the mechanism of a referendum. So about 20 years ago, we started to try to normalize and popularize the notion that you should have referendums on European questions. And this was considered very extreme at the time. In 2005, when I got elected to the House of Commons, I was one of only 7 members of Parliament. There's 650 MPs. I was one of only 7 who believed in Britain leaving the European Union and was prepared to say so publicly. Today, you'll find many, many politicians in Britain who will explain cheerfully how they've always been a Brexiteer, and they'll be quick to tell you it was their idea. And it's wonderful that they think that. I can't remember meeting that many of them in 2005. In fact, I remember a very significant moment in, I think it was probably about 2012, when Boris Johnson, who was then Mayor of London, if I remember correctly, signed our petition calling for an in-out referendum. And this was considered very, very sort of avant-garde. Of course, he didn't say which way he would vote in that referendum, but the idea of popularizing the idea that you know, we should have a referendum was a very difficult battle to have, and we needed to find a way of popularizing the argument. And so this idea that we ran on during the referendum campaign is take back control. There's a sense, I think, in Britain that EU membership means a small elite that you can't hold to account, decides things for you. So we tapped into this notion of take back control of immigration, take back control of our foreign policy, take back control over our regulatory policy. And that really resonated. And it resonated with people who might not be traditional Eurosceptics, who might not, you know, particularly be particularly excited or vexed about immigration policy or whatever it was. we had to find a way of reaching out beyond our base of committed Eurosceptics. And so we put a great deal of effort into testing, message testing, focus group testing, public opinion, working out what people felt, what messages resonated, and beginning to create arguments that appealed to undecided voters and voters who had sort of opted out of the democratic process altogether. And how could we reconnect with them and persuade them? And that was really our big challenge. There are a lot of people in the British Conservative Party who still think of Brexit as being primarily a conversation amongst British Conservatives. If it was a conversation primarily amongst British Conservatives, we would still be in the European Union. We made it a conversation that people outside the British Conservative Party felt that they were part of. It was difficult, but we did it, and I'm pleased with the outcome. I think there are an awful lot of people in Britain today who probably would have been vociferously against Brexit a couple of years ago, certainly 4 or 5 years ago, who I think have come around to recognizing that actually, national self-determination and having democratic accountability, it's not really xenophobic, it's certainly not racist, and you can be internationalist and cosmopolitan and a self-governing country. And I think we're beginning to see some long overdue movement on that.
And it seemed, looking at the results in 2016, that there was just this enormous group of about 2 million or so people who had been completely disconnected from normal political processes, were disaffected with the establishment parties, both Conservative, Labour, and others, but who were somehow mobilized. How do you think that group of people was triggered to come out and vote leave?
Well, I have a bit of involvement in that very issue. In order to force a referendum, I had to, for the benefit of your viewers and listeners, I had to resign from the Conservative Party to trigger a by-election, a special election, and join UKIP, the overtly Eurosceptic party. And for reasons I won't bore your listeners with, I had to do this in order to put the issue of the referendum center stage in British politics. It was a high-risk move. No member of parliament had ever resigned and triggered a by-election when they changed parties in at least 50 years and succeeded. And so it was a high-stakes gamble that I took. But in fighting that by-election to get back into parliament, I was counting on a district in my Essex constituency called Jaywick. It was officially the poorest place in England, the poorest parish in England. Some homes have 60% of people in those homes living on some form of public welfare. It had an extraordinarily low rate of turnout in local and national elections over many, many years. But I realized that it had a large number of people who were very dissatisfied with the way the political elite, both nationally and locally, operated. And I thought to myself, if I could tap into that, if I could mobilize these people who don't normally vote, but are registered voters, to show up, I could win. And that's basically what my by-election was about doing. It was about galvanizing and mobilizing people that the mainstream political process couldn't even see. They'd given up on. They weren't even, because they didn't traditionally vote, they weren't even on the radar screen of the established parties. So we put a great deal of effort in that by-election into tapping into those people. And we won that by-election by a historic landslide. I think it's one of the largest swings to any party in any election in British electoral history, because we got out a cohort of voters who didn't normally vote. And that was really the test run for the referendum. If we could do that on a national scale, if we could replicate what we've done in Essex on a national scale, we could win the referendum. And so the by-election in 2014 in Clacton was, in a way, a test run for the referendum. How do we mobilize the forgotten voters? Now, ever since the referendum, I've had lots of journalists explaining to me why Vote Leave won. I'm happy for them to explain to me why Vote Leave won. Many of these political pundits couldn't even see what was in front of them for many, many years of political reporting. We won because we mobilized people that, frankly, mainstream political journalists don't even know exist. As a very famous political strategist put it to me in the run-up to the referendum, we were trying to get the votes of people who mainstream politicians only met when they collected their dry cleaning.
So 2016 was characterized by another disruptive event across the pond in the United States, where you're now based, and that was the election of Donald Trump. And in many ways, he also tapped into a large silent majority, if you will, of people who felt disaffected with the establishment and that their voices were not being heard. But, you know, what transpired there under his presidency was, in terms of economic policy at least, hostility towards free trade, high degree of protectionism, and also quite high degrees of government spending as well, which is not something that usually characterized the Republican Party. So do you think, I mean, one of the criticisms of Brexit is that it potentially unleashed a kind of nationalist protectionist trend, if you will, similar to kind of Trumpian economics. Do you think that that's a misplaced criticism?
You could never, ever be accused of misplaced criticism if you're criticizing people for being protectionist or insufficiently committed to free trade. I'm afraid the arguments in favor of free trade have to be made and won endlessly and relentlessly. The idea that you can be richer as a people, as a country, by allowing foreigners to supply you with things is just so counterintuitive to the way our brains are wired. It's so contrary to what seems natural. We as a species evolved in, on the plains of Africa, and then as early farmers, where our brains are wired to fear food shortages and to fear a lack of supply. So the idea that you should become wholly dependent on people in other countries to supply you things that you need critically, whether they're vaccinations or foodstuffs or cars or whatever, it just seems so contrary to the way our brains think. We constantly have to make the case for free trade. We constantly have to make the argument that actually, if you don't try to produce everything you need as a country, but you freely buy and sell off other countries that produce the things you want, you'll all be richer. Now, I'm afraid that both in America and in the United States, many of the arguments in favor of classical free market economics are under attack. The American Republican Party has moved a long way from its Reaganite glory days. Under Ronald Reagan, the Republicans were associated with free trade arguments and the free market. Many Republican leaders since the Reagan heydays have worn those free market clothes, but not always acted in a way that Ronald Reagan or Milton Friedman would approve. I think it's one of the reasons why the American conservative movement is in a mess. It's American conservatives have become detached from the philosophical foundation that they need to return to in order to be electorally successful. I think in Britain, conservatism is in a mess for broadly similar reasons. They have an administration that believes it can tax and spend its way out of economic trouble. And they've got an administration that believes it can impact the trajectory of a virus by issuing decrees. But I would say that since arriving in America, I've come to think that American conservatives are they're overly pessimistic. America shouldn't be as pessimistic as many Americans are now. The American fundamentals are in pretty good shape. The American Constitution still works. It still works effectively. There are still constraints upon overly powerful presidents, whether the overly powerful president is a Trump president or an overly powerful Biden president. The Senate still acts as an effective brake on executive decrees. The Supreme Court still thwarts the ambitions of policymakers in DC. The states like my own here in Mississippi, are still free to innovate in public policy areas. So I think actually the fundamentals of American conservatism are in good shape. I think it's Britain where we should be more concerned, Because the American conservatives have lost elections, they're unduly pessimistic. Because British conservatives have won elections, I think they're unduly optimistic. I think British conservatism is even further detached from its sort of Thatcherite, Friedmanite origins. And, it doesn't have this tradition of different states doing different things to fall back on. So, I think the arguments in favor of free trade in Britain really, really do need to be made again. One of the roles I have, I'm a non-executive on the Department of International Trade, the Department of International Trade. I think Liz Truss is doing a wonderful job in selling the merits of free trade agreements. She's negotiated free trade agreements with many countries, new free trade agreements with Australia. There's a free trade deal to be done with America, and I hope South Africa and others. But we are going to have to make the arguments in favor of free trade. Just because we won Brexit, we mustn't assume that we've won the arguments for being an open, outward-looking, non-tariff free trading country. Those arguments need to be made endlessly and relentlessly.
So Douglas, one of the themes of this podcast is decentralization, subsidiarity. And in South Africa, we have many harmful economic policies that emanate from the center, from Pretoria, which inhibit economic activity. And we've had a number of people on the podcast arguing for greater degrees of decentralization to counter that. What is your view on the importance of devolving power, and how does that practically work, and what is the effect of that?
Decentralizing power is absolutely critical for any society to be successful, whether it's a small society like Switzerland, which has different cantons that make policy autonomously, or at the other extreme, the United States of America, which is a United States of America. Each state has tremendous autonomy. Whether you're big or small, having regional autonomy is critical. And the reason why it's critical is because no one group of administrators ever knows enough to know what the future looks like, and therefore never knows enough to get regulation and public policy right. If you allow different parts of a country to do things differently, you get innovation. And in getting that innovation, you get to replicate what works. Take, for example, the United States response to COVID. You've had, in effect, 50 different responses to COVID, because outside federal buildings and airlines, depending on which state you're in, you've had different mask mandates, different requirements to do different things, different social distancing measures. And the rest of the United States can see that and can work out what works. But in a country like the United Kingdom, where you have an incredibly high degree of centralization, you never get to see what works. And so errors go undetected, and mistakes are piled upon mistakes. And it's not just in tackling COVID that you see this. Centralization means that you get public policy errors in all areas of policymaking. The real success for a successful, the key for success in any society, I think, is to disperse power outward and downward. That means regionally, but also amongst competing institutions. It's no coincidence that in South Africa, you traditionally had, I think, the court located in Bloemfontein and the parliament located in one area, and the government, the executive, located in another area. That dispersal of power may have been more theoretical than practical, but I think it's incredibly important that South Africa returns to that tradition of dispersed power. The great success stories in human history are those body politics that are able to ensure that no one faction has absolute control. It's particularly important, I think, in countries where there are different traditions and heritages. I think one of the reasons why Uganda today, a country that I'm very fond of, is much more politically stable, is because although it's a unitary state with a high degree of regional autonomy now. The restoration of traditional rulers, the restoration of some of the rights of traditional rulers, I don't just mean the Bagandas Kabaka, but in Bunyoro and other kingdoms, the devolving of power and authority away from the administrative state in the capital Kampala to different regional groups. I think this is key to explaining why Uganda is a much more stable political country, giving different South Africans greater control over what happens in their locality, their neighborhood, their town, their city, their state. I think that's the key to a harmonious and successful society. If everything's run by a political elite in Pretoria, or everything's run by a political elite in Washington, DC or London, the stakes become far too high for everyone else in the country to not have political power. And politics then becomes a very dangerous contest for absolute power and control.
Douglas Carswell, this has been a fascinating conversation. And I think the lesson that I take away from it is the importance of the sovereignty of individuals and how to push for those rights politically, I think is one of the key challenges of our time. So just wanted to thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and your insights with us.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me on. And it's been a privilege.
If you're watching on YouTube, please remember to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well and leave a 5-star review. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.